On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack across the Pacific. This episode will look at Japan's offensive against America's Merchant Marine, December 1941. I am your host, Sal Mercagliano. I'm the chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science at Campbell University, former merchant mariner, and an instructor in maritime industry policy for the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So usually these episodes deal with current situations going on in the maritime industry. But with this, the 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack across the Pacific, I thought it was appropriate to take a minute and look at how the Japanese attack, specifically the American Merchant Marine, and the critical role that shipping played in this conflict. The Japanese attack, which usually is characterized as an attack on Pearl Harbor, was much more than that. It was an assault all the way across the Pacific. Now, Japan had been at war with China since 1937. And there's a lot of interpretations of the Second World War. I will tell you, my interpretation of the Second World War is that there are two conflicts going on. There's an Asian conflict and a European conflict. And when America is brought into the war by the Japanese attack on December 7th and the German declaration of war on December 11th, it becomes a truly global war. The best interpretation of that, I would say, is right here, Evan Mausley's book, World War II, A New History. I use this in my World War II class. Second edition is out. I think Mausley does a great job at putting that context together. But what I want to look at is several merchant ships that were attacked on December 7th or immediately thereafter, and the important role that they played in the war. So one of the big misconceptions about the Japanese in World War II has to deal with their submarine fleet. Now, Japanese submarines in World War II were nowhere near as effective at interdicting trade as the Germans were, for example. This site right here, Combined Fleet, has an entire section on submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy, their I boats, the RO boats, the different styles of boats that they have. And it notes right here and quotes source that Japanese submarine fleet sank 184 merchant ships of 907,000 gross tons, whereas the Germans, 2,840 ships, over 14.3 million. The Americans, over 1,000 ships, 4.65 million tons. And even the British, with 493 ships of 1.52 million tons. My discussion on this point is this. Japanese I-boats were advance guards for the Japanese Imperial fleet. They went out as a vanguard of the fleet. Wherever the Japanese fleet went, the submarines were the leading edge of that. And that's the important thing to understand. They saw the Japanese I-boats, their big fleet boats, and they were massive, as really the vanguard, as leading the Japanese fleet. So when the Japanese, for example, send the Kido Butai, the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, to attack Pearl Harbor, the Japanese I-boats go out in the front. 3 squadrons of them are deployed. And those 3 squadrons are going to wreak havoc on the U.S. Merchant Marine initially. This predates, by the way, the German assault on the east coast of the United States by a month. And this initial attack by the Japanese I-boats is seen as being a precursor to a larger conflict that is going to aim at American vessels in the Pacific. Now, the Japanese goal at Pearl Harbor is controversial, and there's a lot of videos you can watch with this 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor out there. But understand, the attack was not just on Pearl Harbor. It was on the airfields. It was an attack on Hawaii. And I think that's the most important context to put this in. The attempt was not just to destroy the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, to destroy the air capabilities of the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Navy at Pearl Harbor, but also to interdict the entire Hawaiian island chain. And we see that being executed in several ways. And the Japanese are also doing this, by the way, with American possessions in the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and Midway Islands, key strategic points throughout the Pacific. So the first ship I want to make you aware of is a ship called the SS Cynthia Olson. Now, Cynthia Olson was built during World War I, part of the World War I shipping project. Large shipping program was instituted, and Cynthia Olson was a product of that. At the time of the Pearl Harbor assault, she is under contract to the U.S. Army hauling lumber from the Pacific Northwest to Oahu for use in the construction of new barracks at Schofield, the large army base in the center part of Oahu. The Cynthia Olson is a target for one of these Japanese Vanguard submarines, specifically the I-26. This story here that is out talks about basically the plight of the Cynthia Olson and the fact that a commercial vessel of the ship we're going to talk about here in a minute, the Lurleen, a passenger liner of Matson Lines, which still is in existence today, Matson Line, not Lurleen herself, but Matson Line, is out there. And Lurleen, while sailing, picks up a distress call from the Cynthia Olson that she is under attack by a Japanese submarine. I-26 will attack Cynthia Olson, according to reports, and according to the only reports we have are from the Japanese crew, because there are no survivors. But what we see here is a shore station in California picked up an SOS at 09:38 Pacific time, which was 07:38 Hawaiian time, 10 minutes before the 11 Japanese fires began, devastating machine gun and cannon strafing attacks at Kaneohe Bay. Carlson and his crew must have been profoundly shocked when I-26 surfaced. Submarine was larger than their ship. Through binoculars, the ship's officers were seeing a Japanese type B-1 scout submarine. Now, Japanese scout submarines were large, featured a hangar for a seaplane, because the idea of the seaplane was to be able, again, to wheeled out even further to scout for the main Japanese fleet. I-26 carried 6 torpedo tubes, an aft-mounted 5.5-inch gun, and several anti-aircraft guns. From a range of about 1,000 meters, I-26 fired 18 rounds from her deck gun, but the Cynthia Olson remained afloat. Now, they had signaled for the crew to abandon ship. 20 minutes after the firing, the first shot, I-26 received another broadcast the submarine captain had been expecting from the Japanese Carrier Strike Force, saying that the code Tora, Tora, Tora had been initiated. This is the attack on the islands. I-26 fired a torpedo at the target. The torpedo passed the stern of the intended victim because the crippled ship was still making headway. That led the captain to fire another torpedo and then eventually fire more with the deck gun. Subsequently, the ship is abandoned, and there is a photograph that I believe I had here for you showing the vessel sinking. This is the image taken by the Japanese submarine I-26. I strongly recommend, if you want to read a book on the sinking of Cynthia Olson, is this one right here, Stephen Harding's Dawn of Infamy, a sunken ship, a vanished crew, and the final mystery of Pearl Harbor. He does a great job of documenting these initial attacks as they took place. Cynthia Olson becomes the first merchant ship sunk during the war for the Second World War, from the period of hostilities when the Japanese attack on December 7th. She will not be the last. As I mentioned to you before, the Japanese are going to launch this attempt to interdict trade to Hawaii, to Midway, to Wake, to Guam, and to the Philippines. And you see the Philippines in the case of the SS President Harrison. President Harrison was a cruise liner of the American President's Line. Today, it's known as APL. It's a shell of its former self. It doesn't really exist as it did during this period of time. But American President's Line was a large entity formed out of the Dollar Line that operated in the Pacific. And President Harrison had recently completed the deployment and evacuation of the U.S. 4th Marines out of Shanghai to the Philippines. She was again heading back to the Philippines, heading back to Shanghai to get a load of Americans evacuating from China. Again, everybody knew that war was on the horizon. There was a breakdown in relationships. And so Captain Oral Pearson of the President Harrison sailed his vessel to Shanghai, leaving Manila on December 4th to pick up the remaining personnel that were there and equipment. The ship had been under orders from the U.S. Navy to do this. It's a commercial vessel. And as it heads up there, we find out that war has been declared. And now the vessel has to evade. About 2:30 a.m. in the morning, December 7th, we passed the northern saddles and set course for Shawajin on the north side of the Yangtze estuary. Somewhere around 3:30, I received a message from Cavite that Pearl Harbor had been attacked the show was on. Remember, it's early morning and across the date line in China, so it's December 8th. And the vessel had to basically evade. The captain tried to get the vessel back to Manila. He's unable to do that. And so instead, he decides to run the vessel aground and destroy the vessel as he's being chased by Japanese naval units. The vessel itself is salvaged. It is not irreparably damaged. It will actually be brought into Japanese service. The crew, including the merchant marine crew, are all captured and put into a prisoner of war camp, interned for the war. And the President Harrison is lost. The loss of President Harrison is again another example of the American merchant marine under attack. In this case, this ship was heading from Shanghai to Manila, and we see it being interdicted. Out in the midst of the Pacific, halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines in the Southern Pacific, we find the Pensacola convoy. The Pensacola convoy is a convoy, what's sometimes referred to as the PLUM convoy, heading from the United States to reinforce the Philippines. It's escorted by a heavy cruiser, the USS Pensacola. It has several naval vessels with it, a couple of troop ships, the Chaumont and the Republic, a modified yacht, which is classified as a gunboat, the Niagara, 2 Army transports, the U.S. Army transport Meigs and the Willard A. Holbrook, and then 2 American merchant ships, the Admiral Halstead and the Coast Farmer, and then the Dutch merchant ship, the Bloemfontein. And this convoy is an interesting one. This has been going on for a while, since September of 1941. Reinforcement of the Philippines had been ongoing. The convoy escorted by USS Boise had gotten into Manila on December 4th, but now the Pensacola convoy is in the South Pacific heading that way. And with the declaration of war, this convoy becomes a big target. It's later joined by Australian forces, several cruisers, and it is escorted into Australia, into Brisbane. And the convoy is used to reinforce Australia and really become the beginning bedrock of what becomes the Southwest Pacific forces that are going to be used in the fight in New Guinea, the march toward the Philippines, and eventually defeating Japan. The 2 vessels, the Admiral Halstead and Coast Farmer, have very interesting careers. They remain out in the Southwest Pacific. The Coast Farmer will be lost off the coast of New Guinea, and the Admiral Halstead will stay out there working the entire time. The Japanese decide from the very beginning that they're going to not just attack Oahu and Hawaii, but also send their submarines out. And you can see that here. This is a map showing you the distribution of Japanese submarines off the west coast of the United States. I-26, the submarine that sinks the Cynthia Olson, will deploy off Seattle and all the way down the coast, all the way down to San Diego. A wave of I-boats are deployed. And these Japanese submarines are effective off the West Coast. In December of 1941 and into January of 1942, these submarines begin a period of attacks along the coast. And they are extremely significant, as you see from this report right here. Attacked 8 American ships, of which 2 were sunk and 2 damaged. 6 seamen were killed. It was the first and only time during the 3 years and 8 months of the war to come that more than one Japanese submarine appeared off the American coast. It's interesting to note that the plan that the Japanese had was to culminate on Christmas Day, December 25th, with all 9 Japanese submarines shelling American military and land installations, use their deck guns. That was called off because it was perceived by the Japanese that may infuriate the Americans. They misjudged completely the attack on Hawaii. And instead, they decided not to do that. Instead, the ships basically retired back to the area. Some submarines would make reappearances back off the coast, including a very famous shelling of a refinery off Santa Barbara later, a few months later in early 1942. But this attack off the West Coast does create an issue, because one of the first things that has to be done is a reinforcement of Hawaii. Just a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 3 light cruisers that were not damaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Phoenix, the St. Louis, and the Detroit, all set sail for the US West Coast. And they're heading to the US West Coast because they're going to bring reinforcement convoys from the West Coast to Hawaii. They are requiring escorts. And the USS St. Louis, depicted here, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, will be the first escort. It's going to head to the West Coast and pick up a troop convoy consisting of 3 Matson cruise liners, a ship that included the Lurleen, the vessel we talked about with the Cynthia Olson. Lurleen and 2 of her sister ships, the Matsonia and the, I'm trying to remember the other one. The St. Louis will escort Lurleen, Matsonia, and Monterey, 3 large Matson troop ships, or excuse me, passenger liners, that are now being converted into troop ships. And these ships are going to be the first reinforcements for Hawaii coming across. Matson Line, which exists today, operates in this closed cabotage Jones Act trade between U.S. islands and U.S. possessions. It's really key here. Had Matson not have these vessels, had Lurleen, Matsonia, and Monterey not been available, then the U.S. would have been hard pressed to reinforce its base in the Hawaii. Other American ships are also being loaded and outfitted to not just reinforce the Hawaiian Islands, but also a chain of islands between Hawaii all the way down to Australia, from Canton, Palmyra, Midway, down to Fiji, Samoa, Bora Bora, New Caledonia, Espiritu Santo, all the way to Australia. And these American merchant ships are going to be essential for it. And obviously this attack, or this potential attack by the Japanese on the West Coast, raises a lot of concerns. And so escorts have to be arranged, convoys arranged, and from the West Coast of the United States, what we see is a lot of protection for American merchant ships because of this initial Japanese attack. You also only have a few major ports: Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. So you can basically arrange coastal convoys much easier. Ironically, on the East Coast of the United States, this same thing is not done. And within just a month, by January of 1942, the first 5 German U-boats arrive off the East Coast of the United States and find great pickings because there's no convoy system. Ships are sailing unescorted. And what we see is a killing zone off the East Coast of the United States for nearly 6 months. So I hope you enjoyed that. That was a brief little overview of the role of Merchant Marine early in World War II, especially in the Pacific. This 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack across the Pacific, from the Hawaiian Islands to Midway to Wake to Guam to the Philippines to Hong Kong to Singapore to the Dutch East Indies to Australian territories, the New Zealand territories. The Canadians are involved, Indians are involved. It's a massive assault, a brutal war that's going to go on for over 4 years, had been going on already for 4 years in China, will really occupy vast resources, manpower, and just really be a life-changing event. The Japanese are trying to exert their control over a quarter of the globe. And the key essential ingredient identified, not just in the war in the Pacific, but also the war in Europe, Africa, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Arctic, the Atlantic, is the critical role of shipping in being able to supply. It doesn't do you any good to build the arsenal of democracy in the United States if you can't get the arsenal of democracy from the home front to the battlefront. And that linchpin that does that is commercial shipping. Hope you enjoyed this historical episode of What's Going On with Shipping. Until we get together again, please subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and if you can, please share it across social media and contribute to our Patreon page. Until our next episode, Sal, signing off.